A writer several hundred years ago said, "Seize the moment of excited curiosity on any subject to solve your doubts, for if you let it pass, the desire may never return, and you may remain in ignorance." So seize the moment of being excited tonight with us, and this will be contagious and we will feel it up here. It's my privilege to present Dr. Philip Quanbeck, who is the present chairman of the Academic Events Committee, who will introduce our speaker. But I would just like to say that I once had the speaker as a student in my history class. But let me hasten to add that I also found this kind of a statement: you cannot teach a man anything. You can only help him to find it for himself. You may be the judges whether he found it for himself. Mr. Quanbeck.
Ms. Mortensen, Dr. Chrislock, ladies and gentlemen, we incline toward remembering occasions which celebrate significant events in the past or important people of a bygone era in round numbers. We celebrate the 10th or the 25th or the 75th or the 100th anniversary of a church or a college, or if you get to be old enough, the 450th anniversary of something or other. There is a sense in which the 100th anniversary is hardly different from the 98th or the 103rd, but it is nevertheless customary in our time and place that we celebrate in special ways these anniversaries that come in round numbers. It does afford us the occasion to look back in anger or in joy, as the case may be, and to look forward with either hope or fear. This celebration has been the impetus for the writing of the centennial history here at Augsburg College. That Karl Chrislock accepted the task of writing this centennial history seems to me to be providential. That he did it with as small a reduction in his other responsibilities at the college must be understood as philanthropic dedication. Those of us who know and cherish the college, who have that inexplicable emotional tie to this place called Augsburg, must certainly be grateful that a person so aware and sensitive accepted and really committed himself to this unglamorous task. And all of us can be grateful that a person so competent in the discipline of history and so skilled in the art of writing did this history, and in the writing did not leave aside that artful candor and deliberate understatement so characteristic of our friend and colleague. To wit, when he was writing about the introduction of dancing here on the college campus, he said, "Dismissing the dancing controversy as of less than cosmic significance." Many students responded to the broadening opportunities in art and drama and music. And, good friends, can't you see him hitch up his pants and and squint and say, and I quote, "Food service and medical aid were governed by student power for a longer period than was the library. The future of the boarding club seemed secure until coeducation was introduced in 1922. Arrival on campus of women students and their dean, Miss Gerda Mortensen, sharpened an awareness of the society's shortcomings. Complaints that food preparation failed to meet acceptable standards mounted. The refusal by boarding club officials to sanction the purchase of such items as glass water tumblers and coffee cups with handles reinforced discontent. So did the general level of dining hall decorum, which seemed more like that practiced by a threshing crew than a collegiate community. Twice the winner of the Solon J. Buck Award for Historical Writing in Minnesota history, especially aware and acquainted with protest movements in Minnesota politics in the late 19th and early 20th century, Professor of History and Chairman of the department, I am delighted to have the occasion to present to you Dr. Chrislock, who will address us tonight on the subject, Augsburg College in a Revolutionary Age. Dr. Chrislock.
Well, thank you, Phil. I think you may have aroused some expectations that won't be fulfilled. Now, my conception of this assignment to begin with was very different from what it subsequently became. At the start, I thought that what was called for was a light nostalgic sweep over Augsburg's past with the goal of being humorously anecdotal rather than serious or interpretive. A discourse like this, it seemed, would clear the way for a more sober discussion of contemporary higher education tomorrow. Now, I did negotiate with Phil about this assignment, and when he requested me to undertake it, I remember that I said, well, maybe this will be a little bit like the dead burying the dead. And I should explain, too, now it was remarked over at the Commons that I was on the Academic Events Committee, and I assure you that I didn't solicit the assignment. Now, upon reflection, I came to feel that this original approach would, be a little bit irresponsible. It would, among other things, suggest that Augsburg's historical experience has no value or relevance either to the present or the future, and that our school is a kind of an academic hitchhiker that lacks both self-esteem or any serious aspiration to be a significant institution. Nor would this approach, really recognize the desperate urgency of the times in which we live. So I took the liberty then of changing the assignment a little and discarded the original blueprint in favor of a very modest effort to suggest that there are elements in Augsburg's earliest tradition that may have some value in our own troubled day. Now, that's a little less ambitious than talking about Augsburg College in a revolutionary age. I don't really feel that I'm authorized to talk on a topic like that, even if I were able to. I don't, among other things, hold the presidential title. Now, preoccupation with the present sometimes obscures the reality that American higher education has been in continuing ferment for more than a century. In the 1860s, the decade that Augsburg was founded, most colleges and universities were sadly out of touch with the educational needs of the time. And most of them were still adhering to a course of study based on classical languages poorly taught by inadequately trained faculty. One observer, has characterized the typical college professor of the period as, quote, a nondescript, a jack of all trades, equally ready to teach surveying and Latin eloquence, unquote. Now, parenthetically, it should be pointed out that this description scarcely fitted the early teachers at Scandinavian and German-American academies and seminaries. Many of them had received excellent training in leading European universities, and training that equipped them to teach Latin and Greek with impressive effectiveness, even if it didn't prepare them to meet all the challenges that they found in the New World. Now, by the 1860s, reform of American higher education got underway. A passage of the Morrill Act in 1862, that was the measure that endowed state universities with a substantial land grant on condition that disciplines relating to agriculture and the mechanic arts be given a place in the course of study. Well, this encouraged the introduction of natural science into the curricula. And shortly thereafter, Harvard began to pioneer further curricular reform, discarding its rigid, prescribed Latin Greek course of study in favor of one based on the elective principle and with broader offerings in modern languages, literature, recent history, as well as natural science. Now, at the same time, a strong effort was put forth to institutionalize graduate education, both for the sake of research and more effective college and university teaching. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th century, most of the disciplines that you presently find in the standard college and university curriculum either took shape or advanced from earlier beginnings to higher levels of sophistication. Now, technology and science established a more intimate relationship than ever before, and that was a trend that was underscored by the founding of the first colleges of agriculture and forestry and later institutes of technology. And meanwhile, accreditation guidelines, administered in part by state universities and later by private associations, diffused norms of academic competence throughout the country. Smaller colleges discovered that conformity to the standards of academic competence required by accreditation authorities was a major condition for survival. Now, in the main, and I realize that I'm generalizing the way I am, I'm oversimplifying some things. The lines of development dating back to the last third of the 19th century have shaped the course of American higher education down to our own day. Collectively, these lines of development constitute what might be called the first academic revolution. And this is to borrow an insight suggested by Henry D. Aiken, who is professor of philosophy and history of ideas. And this insight was presented in an article published by the New York Review of Books in July of 1968. The article was titled The Revolting Academy. Now, in our own decade, as we all know, American higher education has come under very severe attack. And not all critics would formulate precisely the same indictment. But a number of complaints appear in most bills. Let's just briefly look at some of those that are most often advanced, and I think you're all familiar with them. First of all, it's charged that while American universities, by and large, cannot be faulted for being academic cloisters, the relationship with society as a whole is unduly confined to highly privileged sectors, and notably the entity called the industrial military complex. While the claims of ethnic minorities and the poor are given no consideration, or at best low priority. It is also affirmed that contractual links between the Department of Defense and the universities potentially, if not in fact, limits the freedom of academic investigation by encouraging or pressuring the universities to mute criticism, shall we say, of the basic premises underlying the conduct of American foreign policy. And as we know, there are profound moral questions involved here too. Many youthful and not so youthful rebels declare the existence of university relationships with firms engaged in the manufacture of napalm and other weapons of death to be intolerable. And as we all know, the Vietnam War has greatly magnified these complaints. Now, closely related to the charge that an unholy alliance with the military and related establishments has compromised American higher education are accusations directed at course content. The primary goal of much of our education, say some of the critics, is preparation for service within an unjust society rather than the liberation of those attributes of personality that must be developed if the individual is to become truly human. Another accusation contends that American higher education is poisoned with an elitism that mocks the democratic ideal, and prevailing methodologies, it is said, violate the autonomy of the student, casting him in the role of a passive recipient in the learning process, rather than an active agent working cooperatively with his teachers. At many institutions, the critics say, undergraduate teaching is a low-priority endeavor, an unavoidable nuisance that's patiently borne by research-oriented professors and worthy of only minimal effort. Now, to predict with confidence precisely what will eventuate from the present turmoil in American higher education requires more boldness than most of us possess. Professor Aiken, in the New York Review of Books article that I previously cited, suggests that we could be in the throes of a second academic revolution, and he suggests that this might produce, and I'm quoting him, new forms of extracurricular activity that would replace Big Ten football with education programs conducted by college students and faculty in ghetto high schools, unconventional do-it-yourself courses by concerned teachers on problems of race relations, experimental work in creative writing and all forms of artistic and intellectual activity that do not fit established conceptions of the higher learning, offbeat interpretations of recent and contemporary history that are not afraid to acknowledge the revolutionary assumptions from which they proceed, and not least efforts towards cross-generational dialogue in which it is not assumed in advance that the only teachers have professorial rank. Now, it seems to me that Augsburg's relationship to the two academic revolutions that we've talked about is rather curious and paradoxical, and believe me, that isn't the only paradoxical facet of the institution's history. Now, on the one hand, the school was tardy in coming to terms with the first revolution. We all know that. It took a long time before we received accreditation. On the other hand, it occurs to me that there are several specific elements within Augsburg's earliest educational program that bear a striking similarity to some of the avant-garde experimentalism of the 1960s. Now, in his introduction to the book Heritage of Faith, that's Melvin Helland's recently published translation of selections from the writings of Georg Sverdrup, Warren Quanbeck, the author of the introduction, characterizes Sverdrup as, quote, a theologian who was almost a century ahead of his time in many respects, unquote. Now, I'm almost tempted to make the claim that the same thing could be said about some aspects of the educational program that was instituted by August Venus and continued by Georg Sverdrup. Now, this phenomenon perhaps is in part attributable to the school's Norwegian background. And let's look at that just a little bit. On the occasion of Augsburg's 25th anniversary, that would be in 1894, Sverdrup affirmed that the school had been founded to provide scope and opportunity within the United States for the 19th century Norse awakening. The passage in Norwegian, the apologies for my pronunciation, read as follows. Derfor byggdes Augsburg for at den norske vekkelse skulle ha vei og virke i det nye land. Now, this statement has been quoted very often by Augsburg spokesmen, and it's generally interpreted in a strictly religious sense. And given the context of the whole situation in 1894, I don't think that interpretation can be disputed. And nevertheless, I think it's important to understand that the awakening, the Norse awakening of the 19th century, was not an isolated revival movement, but an integral part of a broad renaissance that, if I understand 19th century Norwegian history at all, and I'm not an expert on it, conscious of that with our Norwegian guests present, but an integral part of a broad renaissance that touched every major aspect of Norse national life, from religion and society and culture to economics and politics. Now, I think it's also necessary to understand that these other aspects, the non-religious aspects of the Renaissance, perhaps had more influence on Augsburg history than our understanding of the Augsburg tradition has sometimes allowed. I was very interested in Bishop Stoyland's comment last Friday night about the close relationship that has subsisted between Christianity and nationalism in Norway. Now, up to the end of the 18th century, Norway was, relatively speaking, a disadvantaged member of the Scandinavian family. I hope that statement doesn't get me into trouble. By and large, its economic life was rather stagnant, and politically and culturally, a Danish domination held sway. Now, to a considerable extent, the Norwegian people, I believe, lacked pride in their own culture and possessed a rather vague and unclear sense of their own history. Now, the 19th century awakening, to use a term in its broadest sense, substantially changed this situation and closed the gap between Norway and its more progressive West European neighbors. Successive religious movements, beginning with the one led by Hans Nielsen Hauge around the turn of the century, in the late 18th, early 19th century, set the religious life of the country on a new course, revitalizing it. And despite a scarcity of natural resources, the Norwegian economy moved towards modernization as the century advanced. And at the same time, a process of democratization transformed the country's political institutions. And thanks to the efforts of a number of extraordinarily gifted literary men, the Norwegian people, to a considerable extent, rediscovered their own culture, recovered a sense of their own history, and I believe developed a stronger sense of their own worth. Now, a significant fact about this Renaissance, if I understand it at all, is the degree to which its various components reinforced each other. Hauge, for example, manifested interest and concern for economic development, and leading men of letters participated in the battle for political reform. There were, to be sure, important differences in viewpoint. Understand that not all Haugians reacted enthusiastically to the final removal of the disabilities that barred dissenters, religious dissenters from full participation in Norwegian life. And of course, in the last quarter of the 19th century, there was an affirmative response to the secular thought currents flowing northward from the continent, and this created a deep rift within the Norwegian intellectual community between those who remained anchored to traditional Christianity and those who did not. And I thought that perhaps this phenomenon might have had some influence on the development of Augsburg. Now, nevertheless, the degree to which the various components of the national awakening cross-fertilized each other is impressive. Now, the 19th century history of Georg Sverdrup's family, I think, admirably illustrates this reality. In 1814, his great-uncle, also named Georg, presided over the Eidsvoll Assembly, the body that produced Norway's modern constitution. His grandfather, Jacob, engaged in scientific agriculture. Among other things, he pioneered the establishment of agricultural education in Norway. His father, Harald Ulrik Sverdrup, combined a very productive pastoral career with service in Parliament. And Harald Ulrik's brother, and that would be Georg's uncle, Johan, ranks as one of Norway's foremost, if not the foremost, 19th century politician. Now, Johan was the acknowledged leader of the Norwegian left in politics, and his influence helped stimulate the political consciousness of the common people of Norway, and the full establishment of parliamentary government in the 1880s was, I suppose, to a considerable extent due to him. Thus, when Georg Sverdrup arrived in Minneapolis in August 1874, he brought with him a very rich family legacy with which he strongly identified, and a legacy that was thoroughly attuned to a 19th century change. Now, this wasn't all. Although he only 25 years old, he had acquired an excellent grounding in theological scholarship and languages, both classical and modern, and a reputation that could have served as a starting point for a rewarding academic career in the old world. Now, he also discovered when he came here that Augsburg Seminary, the institution he had contracted to serve as a theological professor, was pulsating with life. Now, as all of you will know, because I assume you've read the brochures that have come out, the school was 5 years old in 1874. Its survival through the 3 difficult years in Marshall, Wisconsin, together with its successful relocation in Minneapolis in 1872, on the block between what is now 7th and 8th Streets and 21st and 22nd Avenue, was a remarkable tribute to the fortitude and leadership of August Venås, the first president. Now, shortly after arriving, Sverdrup assumed his first major responsibility, and that was participation with his colleagues in the formulation of an expanded academic program. Now, until 1874, the school's only firmly organized branch was a 3-year theological department. Pre-theological training had been handled by an unstructured pro-seminary department, which President Venås regarded as a temporary expedient. Now, meanwhile, the president was experimenting with a number of other arrangements. One of these included a relationship with Marshall Academy, which was a private American secondary school which Augsburg's supporting church had contracted to operate and maintain in 1869. And he also experimented with an arrangement with the University of Minnesota, delegating to that institution the responsibility for the pre-theological training of men planning to enroll at Augsburg Seminary. Now, neither of these experiments succeeded for a variety of reasons, but the effort to make them work, I think, suggests a strain of desirable pragmatism in Venos's leadership. His report to the 1875 Church Convention commended responsiveness to the lessons of experience as a valuable guideline for a flock of struggling immigrants involved in the task of maintaining an educational institution. So we have here a kind of a tradition of openness from the beginning. Now, the reorganization of 1874, I mentioned a moment ago, established 3 levels of training within Augsburg Seminary. Now, young men with grade school education were eligible to enroll in a beginning preparatory department. In Norwegian, the term is fellesavdeling. This was a branch offering a 1-year program, and a program that ultimately evolved into Augsburg Academy after it was expanded to 4 years. To start with, it was only 1 year. Now, the second tier in the organization consisted of 2 parallel courses, both 4-year and ostensibly college level, leading to the Bachelor of Arts degree. Now, one of these was called the Greek Department course. This was a name selected to underscore Augsburg's quarrel with the Norwegian Latin School, primarily. Now, this was designed for pre-seminary students. The other college-level department was known as, in Norwegian, as the realavdeling. I think that could be translated into Department of Practical Studies. It wasn't exactly a scientific department. Now, its program, which failed to go into operation, this is one of the important things in the early history of the school, was designed for young men not planning to study theology. Now, in addition to Venos and Sverdrup, the faculty charged with responsibility for this expanded program consisted of 2 permanent professors and a number of temporary and part-time instructors. Now, of the other 2 professors, Sven Ruud Gunnarsson, who had assumed his duties simultaneously with Sverdrup, remained until 1883, when disagreement with his colleagues led to termination of his connection with the school. Now, the other was Sven Oftedal. Now, he was alluded to in Molly Ivins' story last Sunday. He was referred to as a hippie-like Theodore Roosevelt. Now, the term hippie-like, I think, is a little imprecise, and it was Molly's idea, it wasn't mine. The comparison with TR might not be entirely inappropriate. Like the American president, Oftedal was charismatic and exuberant, extrovert, and certainly committed to a wide range of interests. In addition to teaching at Augsburg, he served on the Minneapolis School Board, also the Library Board, headed Augsburg's Board of Trustees for many years, engaged in journalism, participated actively in the affairs of the Prohibition Party, and dabbled in modern Greek. Now, soon after Sverdrup's arrival, Oftedal, who had come in 1873, a year before, entered into an unbreakable alliance with the other man, within which I think it's generally agreed Sverdrup was a senior partner. I think at that point any comparison with TR would break down because you couldn't imagine him being a junior partner in any combination. Now, following Venos's departure for Norway in 1876, Sverdrup assumed the presidency. Now, our purpose here is not to sketch the history of Augsburg. We haven't got time for that. So let's now go right into those characteristics of Augsburg policy that I suggested a moment ago did something to establish their leaders as educators before their time. Now, as you hear this, I beg you to realize that we're talking about the 19th century, we're talking about the 70s and the 80s. We're not talking about the 20th century, and the context then was very different. It occurred to me after I'd prepared this that perhaps some of the points I'm making wouldn't seem so revolutionary after all. They wouldn't, of course, if you think of it in terms of the 20th century, but I think that in terms of the 19th they did. Now, first of all, this policy was pronouncedly anti-elitist, and I think the proper word is democratic. It emphatically rejected the standard, that set up the cultivated gentleman trained in Greco-Roman studies as an ideal type. Now, as a young man, Johan Sverdrup had assailed Norwegian university training for producing a professional caste more concerned with maintaining its own prerogatives than serving the people. Now, time and time again, you see the same kind of emphasis in the Augsburg tradition, in the writings and speeches of Sverdrup and Oftedal, indictments of the Latin school, theological education, for producing an aristocracy in an age that was striving to be democratic. In 1891, for example, Georg Sverdrup charged traditional higher education with setting up knowledge of Latin as a boundary separating the so-called uncouth masses from the upper or cultivated classes. Latin school alumni, he said, frequently amused themselves, quote, with Latin witticisms at the people's expense, unquote. Now, it occurs to me that this line of argument is strikingly similar to the one presented in Thorstein Veblen's famous volume on higher education. And this line of argument also, I think, created an impression that language instruction at Augsburg was sadly deficient. Now, I think there's substantial evidence to contradict this assumption. We have the testimony of alumni who later enrolled in leading graduate schools. And we also have Sverdrup's own prodigious linguistic attainments. He apparently had a firm command of Greek and Latin, and an acquaintance with Semitic languages, and a working knowledge of several of the chief modern West European languages. The point was that knowledge of language should be a tool dedicated to the service of humanity and not a status symbol. Now, closely related to this anti-elitist emphasis was an insistence that institutions of learning should not be cloistered retreats, but should rather maintain an organic relationship with the communities and constituencies they ostensibly served. Now, admittedly, this ideal hasn't worked out so well in Augsburg's history. For a long time, we were isolated from our neighbors. But it has to be remembered that since Sverdrup's chief preoccupation was ministerial education, that it would be more proper to look at the relationship that existed between the school and its supporting church constituency. Certainly that rapport and relationship was mutually beneficial. Now, I think I have time here to read a little section that I think illustrates both the anti-elitist and the anti-cloistered motif that I've just mentioned. This piece was written in 1893, or published in 1893. It was written in English, so it didn't have to be translated. And I think it bears unmistakably the mark of Sven Oftedal himself. It was published in Isaac Atwater's History of Minneapolis. It's a story of a financial drive. And that in itself is interesting, and it also tells something about the values of the school, at least the values that Oftedal, as one of the school's leaders, was trying to project. The financial condition of the institution became every year more entangled, he writes. The indebtedness had in 1877 reached $16,000. The churches that never had evinced any substantial zeal for the school grew more and more indifferent. The school, as well as the society, that was the supporting church, threatened to split up into parties and go under. Something had to be done this year. 1877 is therefore the great turning point in the history of Augsburg Seminary. A large and enthusiastic convention in Wilmer, consisting of 1/3 ministers and 2/3 lay delegates, took the matter in their own hands. It was a remarkable assembly. Determined Norsemen and earnest Christian farmers, the large majority of them. Apparently irreconcilable discussions and an insurmountable debt stared them in the eyes. All around the fields were in June dark with the ravages of grasshoppers that infested the entire Northwest, the main support of the school. But nothing deterred them from taking the steps that seemed necessary to save both seminary and society. After long and earnest debates, the convention discharged the last appointed professor and resolved to raise $16,000 cash on condition that if it was not all paid in before January 1st, 1878, the whole amount collected should be returned to the contributors. It was live or die. Professor Oftedal was appointed chairman of a committee to collect this money, with authority to select the committee. He went about the work in dead earnest. He first started a paper that was Folkebladet and printed 10,000 copies. Through this instrumentality, chiefly, and with very little traveling, he organized committees in every church, gave them detailed instructions, and wrought up in 2 or 3 months an enthusiasm hitherto almost unknown amongst the cool-headed conservative people like the Norwegians. The results followed. From the beginning of October, most of the committees were ready to work, and in 3 months, the whole amount, $16,000 and some to spare, was subscribed. In 3 weeks, from the 1st to the 21st of January 1878, after having given orders to send in the amount subscribed, Professor Oftedal received cash, $18,000, contributed by over 30,000 individuals. The school was saved and more. From now on, Augsburg Seminary was not the concern of some ministers or of a clique, but as of right it ought to be, the school of the churches of the people. The farmers got the habit of calling it our school. Well, unquote from Oftedal. I am assuming it's Oftedal. Now, thirdly, under Georg Sverdrup's leadership, Augsburg manifested a distrust of established educational methodologies and a willingness to experiment with new teaching techniques. Now, in addressing the college department graduating class of 1884, part of this I think was quoted in Molly's story, the president leveled an attack, a wide-ranging attack on existing educational practice. There were schools, he said, where the aim appears to be the stuffing of knowledge into youth as one pours peas into an empty sack. Some educators failed to recognize that the cloth should be tailored to the man, not the man to the cloth. At many schools, teachers did all the talking and the students were silent. The teachers maybe were interesting, but the students dull. In such schools, everything is swallowed, but little is digested. And Augsburg, he assured his hearers, was seeking to avoid all of these pitfalls. Now, generally, there is a gap between the rhetoric used by college administrators and the realities on the campus. We always have to look out for that. However, the Sverdrup administration did institute a number of interesting pedagogical experiments. And one of these was the early examination system. We find that under this system, which was based on the theory that education should prepare the student for life rather than examinations, grades based on periodic tests were dispensed with. Faculty members could and did give tests at irregular intervals, but the results were not entered on a permanent record and did not affect graduation. I think this is why the registrar may have a hard time finding records for people back in the 1880s. Now, eligibility for the BA degree depended entirely on performance in a series of written and oral comprehensive examinations that were administered during the last 2 weeks of the concluding college year. Not yearly, but the concluding college year. Now, the first week was set aside for the written portions of these examinations. And in the early years, the written tests covered 4 subject matter areas: Norwegian, English, Greek, and Latin. German was subsequently added. Now, the Norwegian and English examinations consisted of essays designed to challenge the students to think. After being formulated by Norwegian and English instructors and approved by the faculty, these essay problems were announced at the start of the 5-hour examination period. Now, Professor John Blegen, who served the Augsburg faculty for 30 years, and who was a student at the institution from 1875 until 1883, I believe, recalls that in 1880, the Norwegian topic was the relationship between a people's history and its literature. And the English topic was singleness of aim. I think I would prefer the other topic. And English and Norwegian instructors shared responsibility for grading the essays in their respective fields, with one censor for each language appointed by the faculty. Now, final grades were determined by an average of the evaluations made by the instructor and the censor. Now, the Greek and Latin and German written exams measured the student's competence as a translator. At the start of the test, a proctor gave him a published excerpt from the language in question, Greek, Latin, or German, which had not been assigned or studied in the regular language course. Now, no instructional aids such as dictionaries could be used. And following completion of the written portion, each student was subjected to an oral examination of from 15 to 20 minutes, which covered subject matter previously studied in class and might deal with any subject covered in the 4 years. Now, this system was abandoned around the turn of the century, and it seems that one reason, well, there may have been several reasons for its abandonment. There was student pressure for its abandonment. And also, the institution was getting into a situation where it had to conform to general educational practice. Now, extensive field experience was another part of Augsburg's educational program. As students preparing for the ministry were strongly encouraged to spend their vacations teaching in congregational religion schools and assisting pastors, even to the point of filling pulpits on Sunday morning. Now, maybe that wasn't unique to Augsburg, but there was a great deal of emphasis put on it. Now, Augsburg spokesmen frequently underscored the educational value of this experience. There's an interesting statement prepared in 1877 by Sverdrup and Oftedal opposing the creation of a student congregation on campus, primarily because such an organization would limit student opportunity to work within Minneapolis churches. And this statement explicitly rejected the notion, in a rather salty language, that ministerial training belonged solely to theological faculties. Maybe the theological student could learn something from somebody else too. And Sverdrup's 1884 commencement address, from which I just quoted, also emphasized the educational value to be derived from management of campus enterprises such as the boarding club, and Phil mentioned that as an activity entirely under student control. Now, a fourth exciting element in Augsburg's early educational program was its approach to what today would be called ethnic studies. Now, soon after arriving in the United States, both Oftedal and Sverdrup were appalled at what they saw as a depressed Norwegian immigrant situation. Now, Oftedal, who in 1874, that was soon after he came, explicitly accepted the responsibility of helping his countrymen gain what he said was a comprehension of their potentialities, blamed the clergy. They alone, he said, among the immigrants possessed the advantages of higher education. But he didn't feel they were capable of meeting this responsibility. According to him, the typical pastor was, and I'm quoting here, worm-eaten with classicism, bathed in monarchism, frozen stiff in orthodoxy, in addition to being driven by a need for professional status and nostalgic with thoughts of home. It was quite an... Now, in more judicious language, an essay penned by Sverdrup on the public school scored the clergy for not supporting the American public school, an institution that commanded Sverdrup's unqualified approval. As he put it, and I'm quoting from Helland's translation, a large number of Norwegians scattered over America's prairies have been advised by their pastors not to send their children to the public schools. Are we so superior to other nationalities that we can approve such isolation? Norwegians have gained nothing and lost much by not learning what they should have learned in public school. We have not succeeded in identifying ourselves with the country in which we live. We have not acquired the feeling of responsibility that comes from knowing that this is our country and our people. But nobody can deny that we've adopted some of the crudest and most wretched features of American life. We have taken a back seat to no one in drinking and dissipation, and have outdone the, quote, pagan, unquote, Americans in drunkenness and vice. Now, these remarks perhaps suggest a strongly pro-assimilationist point of view. But if they do, Sverdrup realized that instant Americanization was a psychological impossibility. In addressing the graduating class of 1880, he scored immigrant leaders of two varieties. Those, he said, who were seeking to make the cleft between Americans and Norwegians wider than it was, the kind of people who, as opposed to opposed the public schools, and who at the same time seemed to equate assimilation with eternal perdition. These on the one hand, and then leaders who on the other hand saw the difference between the immigrant and native-born as essentially one of language and custom that could easily be swept away by a wave of the hand. Now, I think one of the most interesting things to me that I discovered in this research was that Augsburg's curricular program recognized both sides of the ethnic coin. By that I mean the desirability of early assimilation on the one hand, and the damage both to the individual and to the American melting pot. And that's presumably the American melting pot needed a dosage of Norse culture to get a good mix. This damage that would follow, you see, a precipitous loss of ethnic identity. Now, the statement interpreting the course of study adopted in 1874 expressed the view that not a single one of the many nationalities in America should be permitted to disappear before having an opportunity to make a contribution. Now, it followed that at Augsburg, Norwegian language instruction, Norwegian history, literature, and thought had a place in the curriculum along with the corresponding American disciplines. It was emphasized that both these areas should be given, at least for the time being, equal weight. Now, I think the time has come for me to bring this discourse to a close. And just in summary, my purpose has been, to suggest that the Augsburg of early years was, among other things, now this has not been anything like a definitive interpretation of the school, but among other things, was solidly committed to a democratic educational ideal, that it aspired to be organically united with its constituency and not to be cloister-like, that it was disposed to experiment, and that it was intelligently aware of problems like those faced by ethnic minorities in American society. Now, consciousness of these elements in our tradition might conceivably help us in our present effort to become a Christian college committed to the liberal arts and operated in an urban setting, and not as an ivory tower, but as a creative center of activity. That last phrase is borrowed from Dr. Bernard Christensen's first presidential report to a church convention. Now, it's not that we can, except in a very limited way, apply 19th century experience to the problems of our own day. The point is that we can, I believe, continue on the course that we seem to have elected, while at the same time retaining a sense of continuity with our best traditions.
It has been said that no human soul lives deeply and fruitfully in and by the present, except it be profoundly and affectionately rooted in the past. Carl, you've proved to us tonight that you're both profoundly and affectionately rooted in the past, and all of you are invited to an autograph party. I think the bookstore is open, so you may go in and buy the books and have Carl sign them, and they'll bring double price 100 years from now.